Hello coders, good afternoon or good evening. It's 21:05 here in the UK, and it's another live stream. It is another live show. It is episode 81, I believe, of the How to Code Well podcast, and yes, we are doing it live once more. Today we're going to be talking about Hacktober. I have some views, some opinions, some things that I want to discuss regarding Hacktober, and also we're doing a live QA at the end of the show as well. I have 6 questions that I'm going to be answering. Is that a word? Answering from the community. The questions came from YouTube, Discord, and Twitter. If you've got any questions that you would like to ask during the show, then please do let me know. Put them down in the comments here, and I will get to them at the end of the show. So, first of all, Hacktober. If anybody has seen my newsletter that I put out every week, you'll know that the last one was about Hacktober, and there was a bit of discussion there about my views on Hacktober, and I just kind of wanted to round out some of the edges today and talk about what I think is happening to Hacktober and how it could become better. Because at the end of the day, Hacktober, unfortunately, it caused a bit of a stink this year round, more than normal, and we'll talk about that too. But I also want to just put a spin on it as to how we can improve it in the future. So if you don't know, Hacktober is the month of October where DigitalOcean it promotes hacking, or promotes contributing to the community, to open source in Hacktober. So they have got together with a bunch of I don't want to use the word influencers to advertise Hacktober, and you contribute to a project on GitHub, and you put in like hashtag Hacktober, and then the idea is that you get a t-shirt. You basically win a t-shirt for the amount of times you submit pull requests and so on and so forth. The trouble, though, and it's the same trouble that we've had for many years, it's just this year has kind of, it's kind of, there's more of it, I guess, is that people have been using Hacktober as a means of just quickly getting a t-shirt and not caring about the code that they submit. So it's kind of a cheap and easy way for someone to contribute in a very low quality kind of way. And of course, this has caused a big stink with the maintainers of these projects, because the thing is, in my opinion, the problem is that it's being promoted really, really well. However, it hasn't been explained well enough. The whole act of creating a pull request hasn't really been explained in detail, because there is so much involved with a pull request. It's not just submitting code. It's not this thing where you just set and forget it. Let's just create a commit to a piece of to some code, and then there you go. I've now contributed to this big open source project, and I'll have a t-shirt. Yes, thank you, please. It's not like that at all. There is a lot of things that happen, a lot of stuff that happens in the background that people aren't aware of, in terms of triaging issues, communicating the pull request back to the various maintainers, and having that sort of discussion, that open discussion. And this is all done in an open space, right? And you may think that you can submit some code and that goes off to one person, but in actual fact, it probably goes off to many people. And so what we've effectively done is we've promoted the ability of spamming a lot of maintainers with really poor quality code commits just to get t-shirts. And it's not great. Nobody really talks about the etiquette of writing a pull request, explaining why the pull request is needed, explaining what the issue is being solved and how it's being solved, and also the etiquette of having that discussion with the maintainer. It's not the maintainer's job to just accept every single pull request, and the duration of a pull request to actually being put into production can be quite long. I did a pull request not so long ago to the Codeception project, because I saw that there was an issue with some of the documentation. Now, that typo that I fixed in the documentation didn't actually go out to Codeception in production for several weeks, because it had to be verified and checked. And then, of course, you've got translations and all of that jazz. So it's not a case of just creating some codes, then pushing that up into some sort of pull request, and off you go. And unfortunately, we've allowed, and this is going to sound really gatekeepy, which is kind of what I want to avoid, but I'm going to do it anyway. The barrier of entry is so low because it's been promoted so much that you can get a T-shirt because you can do all of these pull requests. And people were just submitting pull requests left, right, and center without actually thinking about the code, the quality of the code. And it's causing a stink. It's getting the backs up of these maintainers, and quite rightfully so, to the point where DigitalOcean had to do an opt-in. And in my opinion, this didn't happen soon enough. So now there's an opt-in where projects have to opt in to become part of this Hacktober event. But this, I feel, has come too little, not soon enough, unfortunately. And I fear that next year there's going to be a lot of projects that just don't bother with Hacktober, which is a shame, because on the one hand you've got all of these maintainers who are saying that Hacktober has just been nothing but painful for them, and then you've got the other group of maintainers who quite rightfully are trying to find ways to bring people into open source in a better way. They're constantly asking how can we get more people working on our projects. But there needs to be a level of education. It's not a case of just submitting code and off you go. There's a whole process, and there's something I've been thinking about it a lot. Perhaps there needs to be a series of videos that I do, and other people in this space do, where they demonstrate a pull request in a real world project, to go through the timeline and actually discuss and demonstrate from creating a pull request to actually putting it into code, and whether that can be just through documentation or whether it's actually a feature, that kind of thing. I know that we do a lot of stuff on Twitch, but it's kind of all the stuff we do on Twitch, unfortunately, is closed source. But I'm thinking maybe if there is something that I do that is open source, then I could use that as an opportunity to highlight the actual process of a pull request. But the thing is, I then started thinking, would I want to be part of this Hacktoberfest? If I'm having to deal with people just putting in some really shoddy lines of code or just some commits to a README file simply for the fact that they don't care about the project, they just want a T-shirt at the end of the day, that's not actually helping the open source community at large. So I don't think I want to be involved with it. And unfortunately, I think that's the same view that a lot of people are going to have. And DigitalOcean did this really big push with, getting people who have Twitch streams and YouTube channels and all of that, saying, demonstrating how they can do pull requests and how simple and easy it is to get this T-shirt. But not a lot of them, unfortunately, discussed the actual ins and outs of what a pull request does. What happens to your pull request once you've submitted it? What are the decisions that the maintainers have to make? What is the etiquette that you have to adhere to when you're discussing your code and the changes. There was some stories that I heard, unfortunately, where people were putting in like huge amounts of change in a pull request, and it was like the maintainer was like, I'm not even going to read this because this is ridiculous. You've now just changed all of the stuff. I mean, there was one I read that they changed it from tabs to spaces, or was it spaces to tabs, some code formatting, just because the person didn't like it, but the person who was submitting the code didn't like it, and they just wanted that as another number that they could tick off to get their T-shirt. And so the maintainers have to deal with all of this craziness for 1 month of the year. And as Nabal has said, testing is mostly overlooked along with the practices that the maintainer has defined. Sure. So things like code styles. If you've got a style guide, right, that your open source project adheres to, then there's a lot of times where that doesn't, people who submit code don't bother following that. And then you would hope to think that there was some process involved that prevents poorly formatted code coming in. But as you mentioned, quite rightly so, testing, submitting loads of pieces of code without testing it, because that's the boring thing, right? Nobody wants to test code, right? They just want to get this T-shirt really, really quickly. And so, unfortunately, I think DigitalOcean has made this real big push on how easy it is to write code and submit code and all of this stuff, but they haven't actually talked about the fundamentals of what happens to a pull request. And when you're writing a pull request, you need to be invested in the project. You are committing code and time and energy into a project, and it doesn't matter if you're doing you're fixing a typo in documentation, or you've found a bug in some code or an issue in code, but you are invested. It doesn't matter how much you're invested, you are invested in it. And so whatever you do should be done to enhance the quality of that project. It shouldn't be a selfish act just to get a T-shirt. It should be to enhance and to grow for the better that project. It shouldn't be just for you, right? That's the whole point of open source, right? It's not all about one person. It's about everybody, right? It's about everybody who's using that project, and you have to do it with the project in mind. And yeah, I mean, hats off to DigitalOcean. Obviously, this is a marketing thing, right? So you get a T-shirt, it's got a DigitalOcean logo on it. You've got to go to a DigitalOcean website to do all the bits and pieces. You're going to get DigitalOcean marketing emails and all of this stuff. So, they're not stupid. They've done it for marketing. But I think that the execution hasn't been done very well. That's basically my point. And I think what I'll do is I'll leave it there, because otherwise this might turn into a bit of a rant. And I must say I'm not sponsored by DigitalOcean at all. So that's my take. Basically, that rounds up the email that I sent out, the newsletter that I sent out. If you want to join the newsletter, by the way, do check out go to email.howtocodewell.net/sign up, and you can join the newsletter there. I'm being told it's Nebel. Nebel, is that correct? I'm sorry for mispronouncing your name. I may just revert back to Exabyte 3 because I know you're a good viewer on Twitch, and you actually have one of the questions that I'm going to be answering later today. And talking about the questions, eel like fish. Fair enough. Talking about the questions, we have. I've got 6 questions that I'm going to go through. These are questions that have been given to me over the last few months, and some of which I have answered. But I just thought this would be a great way of talking about it in more detail. Sometimes I find that when I'm responding to people on in the comments, whether it's on Discord, whether it's on YouTube, whether it's in Twitter, those mediums aren't really great for actually having a discussion. It's like Twitter. You only have a certain amount of characters to put in. YouTube comments, in my opinion, are just terrible. The amount of code that I get people send me over YouTube comments is ridiculous. YouTube is not the way to talk about code, which is a real problematic when you've got a programming channel, right? Discord is really good. Discord's a good medium to have a discussion, because then you can actually have a good discussion with a group of people, which is great. I just wish Discord was a little bit more like Slack and had replies, so you can actually reply in line. Otherwise, you get people sort of talking over each other, which I find can be quite confusing sometimes. Anyway, let's get into the questions. So, Melonbruh. Melonbruh says, great video, but can I ask, is it competitive to become a web developer in the UK? Over in America, the market is very saturated. Is it the same in the UK? So, basically the question is, in the UK, is it a saturated market, web development? It really depends on what you define or what you want to do in web development. In my opinion, and I can only talk about the area in which I'm in, because this is very different depending on where you are in even in the UK. There's a lot of WordPress. So if you go to, I think, any kind of web design, web agency, WordPress is a skill that you kind of really need to have. But it does mean that there's a saturation there of WordPress developers. And then, I mean, with that, you've got good developers and bad developers and so forth. Also, I think Magento is highly saturated too, but I think that's mostly to do with legacy, in the sense that a lot of e-commerce sites are on Magento and have been on Magento for a long time, and a lot of the work that I've had over the years has actually been taking Magento off of Magento, or upgrading Magento from version 1 upwards, or taking Magento and putting it onto another platform. But Magento seems to be the kind of the thing for e-commerce. But in terms of actually getting into the industry, I don't think it's saturated to the point where it's difficult to get into the industry. I think that I still think that there's room for people to actually get a decent junior job from the off. It's not a case of everyone's a coder. So, I mean, I can only speak from here. I can't say what it's like. I can't even say what it's like in Birmingham, right, which is just up the road, or even in London. I don't know what it's like there. I can just say what it is around sort of the Gloucester/Bristol area. And at the moment, it would seem that WordPress, Magento, so WordPress if you're doing a blog site or a catalog site, that's kind of like the go-to, or Magento if you're using e-commerce. But in terms of actually getting into the industry, it's not a problem. I certainly didn't find it a problem back in the day when I joined. But I'm seeing, because I keep my ear to the ground in terms of recruitment, I keep seeing jobs coming in for juniors who, thick and fast. So it's not a case, and well paid as well. So it's not a case that everybody's, like, the market's so saturated that the money's down. So I don't think that's too much of a problem. So I hope that answers that question. Okay, Cyprian has said, do you do a lot of complex algorithms in PHP development? So, this is an interesting question because it depends on what you define as an algorithm, complicated algorithms. I guess, going back to the e-commerce stuff, the algorithms that I've been working on recently are things like shipping, things like delivery, things like trying to work out where you are in the world, how much you've got in your cart, that kind of thing, and doing price conversions. Also doing a lot of stuff with search, so searching based on fuzzy matches or searching based on different sort of variables, filters coming through, and then sort of doing that in a very performant way. I guess, you've said PHP here, but with the search, I've been sort of leaning on things like Elasticsearch, and then sort of filtering that out through PHP. So I guess it really depends on what you mean by complicated algorithms. There are certainly algorithms that we do in PHP, probably not as complicated in, say, the security sector or, say, the financial sector. But then I don't think they'll be using PHP for their backbone. I think they'll be using things like Go. I think they'll be using things, even Rust or Python, for instance. And they'll be doing more complicated algorithms, more complicated things like that. PHP essentially is the back end to the web, right? But there'll be lots of other things that go on behind those scenes, such as financial stuff, security stuff, and all of those kind of jazz, which is tailored towards other languages other than PHP. So the third question is, sorry, just looking at my notes. IC Killer YT. I'm curious, why did you choose Flow over TypeScript? So I did a video talking about Flow and using Flow as a means of for JavaScript, as a means for doing some type checking. And I chose Flow over TypeScript simply because I do not know TypeScript. I've never used TypeScript before. Never used it before at all. If I look at it, I don't really understand it. It's something that I've never really needed to learn. I suppose all of my jobs have been mostly centered around the back end with some full stack sort of front endy stuff around it, but it's never really been a full front end role. So there hasn't really been a need for that kind of for TypeScript. I only used Flow, and I think this, if I remember rightly, this is from that API client that I created for the How to Code Well website, which is in Flow. I chose to use Flow just out of pure curiosity, because I was using React, or I am using React, and Flow works really well with React. So yeah, it's a question of sort of I didn't have enough time to do both, and really I don't think I'm going to have enough time to explore TypeScript and to make that decision. I'm probably, which is a shame really, because I'm sure I can do a lot of better things in TypeScript, as people have told me. It's just Flow to me seemed like a smaller barrier of entry. And it did what I needed at the time, so that's why I chose it over TypeScript. That's essentially why, to be honest. And so far, Flow seems like a good fit for what I need. Will I change it later? Yes, probably. The new shiny and all of that stuff. But it's really down to time. Really, really down to time. So the next question is John Kim. It looks like you are using Atom IDE. Which packages are you using? Auto-completion looks excellent. So this is a question that I was asked on one of my PHP tutorials. And no, I do not use Atom IDE. I've never used Atom IDE. I had to look up what it was when I was asked this. So I use PHP Storm, and I have been using PHP Storm for many years. I think it's brilliant. I think it's a great IDE, and it does exactly what I need it to do, and a whole lot more. A whole lot more. It is a paid-for thing, right? So you do pay for a license. But personally, I think it's worth it. I think it's worth it. I've spoken to a lot of the people at IntelliJ when I saw them at conferences and stuff, and they seem like they are on the ball. And you know that it's nice to have that commitment from people who are building the tools. It's nice to know that they are continually upgrading and making the experience of writing PHP code much better. So in terms of the auto-completion, I think you're talking here, John, about the command line. So I use iTerm. Is it iTerm? Let me just double check. It is iTerm. Yes, it's iTerm. So I work on Macs, primarily Macs and Linux boxes. And on Macs, I use iTerm. And with iTerm, I use Z shell. So I don't use strict bourne-again shell. I use Z shell. And with Z shell, there is a load of plugins that you can get. One of which I use is... well, it's not a plugin. It's kind of a suite of plugins, I suppose. It's called Oh My Z Shell, ZSCH. I think that's how it is. Someone will probably tell me in the comments if not. And it's that Oh My Z Shell allows you to have other things and configure the Z Shell easier. And so I have an autocomplete plugin that I use, and it's great because as you start typing on your command line, it kind of looks into your history and then tries to predict what you're going to type next, which is so useful. And what it does is it populates the command prompt with sort of a gray, sort of dull sort of text as to what it thinks you're going to do. And if it prints out the full command that you want to do, you just press right, and it goes right to the end of the line, and then you press enter. And there you go. You've just auto completed your whole command. And the thing is with this is that with the IDE PHP Storm, you can then hook that into your iTerm or your terminal, which will then read your Z shell RC file, which will then have all of these plugins ready to go. So yes, I use PHP Storm instead of Atom. There was another question here, and I do apologize about mispronouncing this name. It's Baranki Narang. I'm sorry, Baranki. How to configure multiple Python Flasks apps, each running in separate Docker containers with Docker Compose. So how would you do that? So I am assuming this question is based on sort of like you have many websites that you want to sort of host in Docker containers, and you want to somehow access those through your browser, and you go to a web page, a website, and it loads up a Docker container A. You go to another website, it loads up Docker container B, that kind of thing, right? So how you would do this, how would you configure multiple Flask apps? So apps, websites, yeah, each running in their separate Docker containers with Docker Compose. So with Docker Compose, what you would do is you would create services. So each one of your apps would be a service. Say, for instance, it would be, just out of off the top of my head, you would have a service perhaps for authentication. You might have a service for, say, I don't know, a rating system. Or if we're talking about websites, it's probably easier if we do websites. You might have one which is a blog, you might have one which is a microsite, and you might have another one which is, say, your e-commerce site or something like that. But the thing is, you want to access those Docker containers individually. And the thing is that each one of those are going to be running port 80, right? So, or 443 or what have you. And you need to map your host entry to those containers. Now, those containers, the difficulty here is that those containers are going to have a different IP address every time you spin one up and spin one down. This means that you can't just map an IP into your host file. You can't just simply do that one-to-one, which is a problem. I get around this by creating a Docker machine. So a Docker machine is basically a little VPS that you create on your system, and that VPS has an IP address, and then all the Docker containers within that Docker machine can then be, you can then expose those ports, port 80, 443, what have you, to that IP address, and then you can, in your host entry, you would then map a actual domain name to that IP address. Trouble is, I mean, that's all well and good, right? But what happens if you want to go one step further and have multiple services within that Docker machine? This is where you would have reverse proxies. So you would have Nginx or Apache, what have you. You would have a web server. You would have a container, which is a web server, and it would be listening to traffic, and then doing a reverse proxy back to one of the services. So let's say, for instance, if you went to /users, it would take you to the users container. If you did /blog, it would take you to the blog container. Or if you change the vhost, you can actually do it by proper domain names, and you can map them back. The How to Code Well website at the moment, the new one, it uses something similar. It has a gateway, and that gateway, which is a very lightweight Nginx web server in Docker, it listens to certain requests, and then it forwards those requests onto the various different containers, and then obviously the containers respond back, and it looks as though you're requesting to multiple different websites when actually you are just sending your requests to that one gateway. It means that you can then have things going on in that gateway to deal with authentication, caching, and all sorts of other bits and pieces. A good example here is if you have different subdomains, and each of those subdomains makes a request to a gateway. Because you've created a subdomain, you have a different sort of address, I guess, and then you could create a server block in Nginx for each one of these, and they would then send a request to a specific container. Like, for instance, we have one for the CMS, we have one for the API, and we have one for the assets, for the CDN. They're all going back to the same gateway. The gateway does the authentication, does the caching, and so on and so forth. I hope that kind of has answered that question. It's kind of gone off on a bit of a tangent there, but I hope that has sort of answered that. I'm going to just grab some tea. And the last question from Exabyte 3. I do apologize for mispronouncing your name earlier. The last question was about the average duration of my projects. So what is the average duration of my projects? So I did kind of answer this sort of on Twitter earlier, where I said it was sort of between anywhere from 3 months to 3 years, I think I said. It really depends. And it's going to sound like a non-answer here, but it really does depend. My longest contract was 3-4 years, but in that there was time where I could actually do other work as well. So it's not like that was the only sole thing that I was working on. which was nice. But it really depends. When you're a contractor, like myself, you usually get asked to do 3 months as kind of like, I don't really see it more. I don't see it as a sort of a probation period. It's more of it's, well, I suppose it is, in the way that they use that time to see if you're any good. Although you kind of need to be good to get the contract, I guess. But it's usually a case of where they say, it's a 3 month with a rolling extension. And when you look at some of the specifications, or when you have your initial meetings, you know that the project is going to, and they know the project is going to be more than 3 months long. So, it becomes blatantly obvious if they expect it to be done in 3 months, and and it shouldn't be done in 3 months. It needs to be done in 6 months, right? But if they've given you a big task that is going to take more than 3 months long, and they are aware of that, then that there could be a potential for it to be rolled over. The problem I have, which is something that, well, it's not a problem. It's just a trait that I have. I don't like I don't like just being sort of parachuted onto projects and just sort of like do a little bit of code here and then go away. I know contractors who really like that. They prefer that. They haven't seen many projects go live because they've just been power dropped onto a certain bug or feature or some sprint that they've worked on, and then that's it. They've gone on to something else. With me, it gets to a point where I value seeing the work in the live, out in production, as much as I value, the monetary side of things, which is okay in some respects, but it means that I guess on the negative hand is that I have had less contracts than many contractors in this time span that I've had. Which means that I haven't had enough sort of coverage on different technologies, which is probably, the question we had before about Flow versus TypeScript. If I had more contracts, if I was doing smaller amounts of time on projects, and I had more contracts, then I would probably have more exposure to more technologies. So the longest I've had is about 4 years. The shortest I've had is about 6 months. Every contract I've had has rolled over, has extended, which is something that I'm actually quite proud of. But it is something that was flagged up. Actually, a recruitment agent asked me. They said they noticed that my contracts were quite long, and they were like, some clients like this and some clients don't like this. So it's I don't know. We could go into a whole different subject as to when to come out of a contract, or when a contract is good, and all of that kind of stuff. But it'll be interesting to hear what the average is across the board. From everyone else, freelancers and contractors. What's the longest time and shortest time, and the average time of being in a contract? Because the thing is that going back to one of the questions about saturation of the market, I know that there's lots of programmers out there, and I know for a fact that if I was to break a leg, break my arm, something happens where I'm out of work, the projects that I'm working on, they're not just going to go in a tailspin. They're going to get another contractor on board and finish the job. So it's not something that I think is. So on one hand, it's not a saturated market, but on the other hand, it's kind of like I know that that I can be replaced, if that makes sense. So yeah, I hope that makes sense. It's a bit waffly, isn't it? A bit waffly. So Exabyte is saying, I've heard Shopify has been taking off too. It has, yeah. I've never used it. I've never used Shopify ever. I've looked into it. I've created a sort of a test account, but I've never used it myself. But I know that there is plugins for Shopify and WordPress. And this could be another discussion, that we do in the future. Is WordPress and Shopify dumbing down web development? Because I mean that's a topic in itself. You can create e-commerce shopping carts that 5 years ago would have been unheard of. You can create those with a few clicks of a button now. Off the shelf, not bespoke, of course. There's big negatives for off the shelf stuff. The stuff that is just the same as everything else. And the difficulties of bending that to your will in the future. I mean, that's a whole different discussion there. But yeah, no, I've never used Shopify. Yeah, for example, an e-commerce site from scratch. How long would that take as a baseline? So how long does it take for an e-commerce site from scratch? Wow, gosh. So I would probably say that the longest time the thing that takes the longest in terms of building a site is having the sign off from many people and getting to a point where all the features have been created in the sense of they've been tried and tested. Because I've never created a project where it's been the finished article has been exactly what has been defined down to the letter. I've never done a project where it's just been like, you get a specification and then suddenly it's done, right? You can say, oh, I've quoted this and it's going to be, I don't know, 3 months long. And it's going to take, and it is 3 months long. I've never been in that situation, because when you speak to a client, they've obviously used the web before. Yes, they've obviously they know what they want, right? But when they actually use the thing that you've built, there's always that sort of umming and ahhing. There's always that kind of middle ground where they don't know exactly what they want until they see it, or they don't they can't have they don't see it in terms of the vision until it's out there, or they didn't expect it to behave in the way it behaves with the other features. So there's always this sort of piece of ground where you're not redoing things, but there's flexibility time, and that's the flexibility time is the thing that takes the longest in a project. Getting things like VAT rules and pricing rules and all of that stuff done, that can be all decided because that's off of a spreadsheet, right? You can make those kind of decisions on paper. But in terms of getting things looking good, in terms of getting things functionally and UI and actually seeing how the search behaves and all of that, that is the thing that takes the time. So in terms of how long it takes, I guess as a baseline, I would probably say, if we're looking at a small website, I'm probably going to say something like 3 months. If it's a large website, we're probably talking, it may even be, it really depends on the meetings and the umming and ahhing. It depends on the size of the project. It depends on the amount of people involved, because when you've got lots of people involved, then you've got lots of different agendas, lots of different decisions to make, lots of different buy-ins. and that can balloon the project. But yeah, I suppose from start to finish, a basic e-commerce site, 3 months in terms of getting it built and getting it up, and to the point where you've got, say, your SEO done, you've got your marketing sort of side of it done, because it's more than just a website. When we're dealing with e-commerce, it's more than just putting things in a shopping cart and pressing buy. It's also getting things like, email signups. It's like getting things like your search and your analytics and working out user journeys and all of that jazz, and upselling and making things sort of usable, and this, it's more than just a shopping cart. But then if we're talking about big clients, where there's lots of people involved, lots of different departments involved, lots of different assets, lots of different things involved, lots of ideas flowing around, then we could be talking months, we could be talking even years, to be honest, because it's one of those sort of it's one of those repeatable processes. You show work, and then the work gets refined and tried and tested, and then often changed. So yeah, I mean, I know that I've been on projects where I've been put onto a project halfway through the project, and I know that project has already been in development for a very long time. So yeah, do I take multiple contracts at a time? It depends on. At the moment, no. Because that just time. You just cannot do that. You have to put all your, with the contracts that I'm on at the moment, you have to put in your hours, right? As in, like, you have to. It says in the contract that you need to do this amount of hours. You just can't physically get another contract in. And also with certain contracts, you have to, you certainly have to abide by their rules, and therefore you've got to be careful with, what's the word? I can't think of it. It's conflict of interests, right? So you can't be working for X if you're working for Y, or you can't be doing this if you're doing that kind of stuff. But usually it's down to time. If I cannot physically do another contract because I've quoted and I've agreed to do 5 days a week for this one contract, then there is no chance in hell that I'm going to do another one. However, about start of the year, end of last year, I was working for 2 companies at the same time, and they were, one was 2 days, one was 3 days, I believe, and then and that was great, and that was in the contract. It was, you do 3 days here for this contract, and then you would do 2 days over there for that contract, and they didn't care. They it was like they didn't know what I was doing. And there was no conflict there. And then before that, I did 4 days a week on a contract, and I spent a lot of time on the Friday producing videos for YouTube, and I was in that contract for a very, very long time, which was really, really good. I loved that contract, but unfortunately, that's, contracts end, and you've got to just roll with it, and now I seem to be working far more than I've ever done, which is great on one hand, but it does mean that How to Code Well has unfortunately suffered. But with freelance and contracting, you've kind of got to roll with it, because especially around these times with COVID times, so the How to Code Well has been quite fluid and flexible. It kind of works around the work that I have. That's why I stream Tuesdays in the morning at 7 in the morning, and Thursdays here, which is 9 p.m. in the afternoon, and then on Sundays at 2:30 on a Sunday. That's usually the longer stream. So I don't do any How to Code Well in working hours, just because I can't. Not only am I becoming physically exhausted, but I'm also becoming mentally exhausted with all the bits and pieces that I'm up to. Okay, let's go back to the questions, Mo. Came across this framework built on top of Laravel. Ooh. This is from is it Asim? Asim came across this framework built on top of Laravel called, oh gosh, Appetito. Follows the proto architecture. I haven't heard of that. If you have the time, could you comment on that? Oh, I tell you what. Well, I've never heard of that. But what I'll do, Asim, if you're okay with this, I will look at this up because this sounds interesting. I will look this up, and I'll comment on it when I know more about it, I suppose. It's built on top of Laravel, so it's a framework on top of a framework. That's interesting. Okay. Yeah. What? I also don't know what the Porto architecture is either. So I don't know what I just don't know. This is showing my naivety and my stupidity, perhaps. I pronounced it right. That's probably the only thing I've pronounced right tonight. Wow. Gosh, I'm gonna have some. I'm drinking elderberry tea, by the way. Yum, yum, yum. Well, we're coming up to the top of the hour. It's been great to do this. I would like to do this more often, to actually talk about the questions that I get in full in more detail. So I'm hopefully going to do this more often. But if you've got any more questions, though, then do let me know. Obviously, fire them at the Discord server. Go to howtocodewell.net/Discord. If you're not a member there, then do please consider joining. And also hook me up on Twitter and at howtocodewell. Everything is at howtocodewell. And if you wanna watch me try and do some code at 7 in the morning, then do check out the Tuesday streams as well. Anyway, for those watching on the YouTubes, happy coding. And I'm going to put this onto the podcast next week. So for those listening, happy coding as well. Thank you ever so much